Welcome to today's library seminar titled An Ecosystem Lens for Evaluating Deepwater Horizon Impacts and Effects of Some Restoration Activities. I'm Lisa Clark, Reference Librarian at the NOAA Central Library. This presentation is part of the Ecosystem-Based Management Seminar Series, which is put out by NOAA Fishery's Office of Science and Technology. Peg Brady from that office will introduce our speaker, Dr. Steve Murawski. Before we begin, here are a few logistical tips to help you enjoy our presentation. If you're having trouble with the audio or visual components of GoToWebinar, please log out and rejoin us. This usually resolves most technical issues. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on the NOAA Central Library YouTube channel, as well as the Library Seminar's website later today. We will also be accepting questions throughout the webinar, which Steve will address at the end of his presentation. I encourage you to type your questions into the questions chat box on the right side of your screen at any time. If you're interested in the slides from today's presentation, Steve has shared them with us. Please feel free to download them from the handouts menu on the right side of your screen. So with that, I thank you for attending this library seminar and turn the presentation over to Peg.
Thanks, Lisa. Greetings, everyone. This is Peg Brady from NOAA Fisheries headquarters based in Silver Spring. As Lisa mentioned, I'm within the Office of Science and Technology. And today we're continuing our 2020 NOAA Ecosystem-Based Management, Ecosystem-Based Fisheries Management Seminar Series. We initiated this in November of 2017. Our main objectives have always been to showcase the excellent projects that are being implemented by NOAA Fisheries, as well as our partners. And we do have a partner with us joining us today who is advancing EBM in the Gulf region. Also, to increase awareness about EBM and EBFM activities with a focus on what NOAA is undertaking to better understand marine ecosystems, and also an opportunity for some of our staff to highlight their ecosystem-oriented work. The NOAA Library has always been our co-host in this series, and we're very grateful for their support, and thanks to Lisa and Katie Rowley, who have been team members with us on this. The seminars are all held on the second Wednesday of each month between 3 to 4 at Eastern Time. Each presentation, as Lisa pointed out, is publicly accessible, recorded, and archived. And the past recordings, past seminar recordings are available at that NOAA Library YouTube site. Following today's presentation, Steve will hopefully answer some of the questions. And if there are any detailed questions, we're happy to suggest you take that offline. Steve will provide you with his email address, and you can follow up if you have more in-depth questions. And thanks to our speakers. Today, as I say, we have Dr. Steve Murawski, who many of us know, who was formerly the Chief Science Advisor to the National Marine Fisheries Service, was with NOAA for over 35 years, and is currently the Peter Betzer Endowed Chair of Biological Oceanography at the University of South Florida. And we welcome Steve, who is presenting from his location in St. Petersburg, Florida. So thank you, Steve, and thank you for all your efforts in joining us today.
Well, thank you, Peg, for inviting me like Old Timers Day at Yankee Stadium. Appreciate that, and also to Lisa Clark at the library for setting this up. It's been a decade since I worked at NOAA, and I left at the end of 2010, right after the Deepwater Horizon event. I had no intentions whatsoever of actually working anymore on Deepwater. But like the mafia in The Godfather, it's something that just keeps drawing you back. And so over the past decade, I've been fortunate to work with some really talented people on the consequences of Deepwater Horizon. And what I wanted to talk about today was looking at many of the issues that have arisen in terms of ecological effects of Deepwater through a different lens, more looking at the ecosystem significance of these impacts, in addition to looking at specific species and species groups impact. My collaborators here are Tracy Sutton from Nova Southeast University, Will Patterson from the University of Florida, and Patrick Schwing from Eckerd College. And all of us have worked on these kinds of issues since the inception of the event. So let me just see if I can get this rolling here. Okay, just to bring people back a decade ago, the event initiated on April 22nd of 2010. I was actually in Japan at the time on, ironically, a fisheries and climate symposium there. And by the time I got back, I didn't realize exactly how big this thing was going to be, but certainly it occupied my entire year from then on. The spill ran for 87 days without capping and released somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 million barrels. It kind of depends on who you talk to and what you take off for what was captured, et cetera. And importantly, there were 11 people that lost their lives. And the spill itself spread over 200,000 square kilometers of surface, and even more if you count the subsurface dispersal. So the massive spill in terms of not only the quantity, but the breadth of what the range of the areas it was spilled to. There are a number of ecosystem-related issues that are what we would consider overarching issues in looking at the impacts of Deepwater Horizon. Certainly, and this is where a lot of the damage assessment was, changes in the resource abundance and the demography of many resource populations associated with Deepwater Horizon, and that included things from birds, fishes, turtles, marine mammals, et cetera. Obviously, the issue of recovery times and recovery levels, that is recovering from what to what over what time frame, is really important in terms of making these projections. And much of the restoration activity that currently is ongoing is related to recovering to somewhere over some time frame. The pertinence of the concept of baselines is really important. Many of the people that have worked on Deepwater Horizon over the past decade and have published have bemoaned the lack of baseline information. That is, what was the state of the system the day before the accident itself. But the question is that a stable baseline? And given all the other changes in the Gulf, are those baselines in fact changing due to other circumstances? And so this concept of return to baseline is really an important one and a very difficult one. Obviously, one of the things that we've tried to monitor, particularly in the over time, are contaminant concentrations, and that is before and after the spill, trying to find some control locations that we could look at, and then of course the impacts of the spill itself. This has been a very frustrating thing to actually get a handle on, primarily because of lack of baselines before. And so many cases in ecology, you can substitute space for time. That is, find a control area that you consider to be non-contaminated, and then compare that. One thing that we found out in our analyses of what goes on in the Gulf of Mexico is that finding a pristine control area is virtually impossible. There's a lot of hydrocarbons in the environment. Obviously, and this is probably one of the major take-homes of both Exxon Valdez and Deepwater, and that is that the paradigm of looking at impacts to animal populations primarily was the province of LC50s, that is looking at lethal effects. But now it's pretty important that we consider these sublethal impacts to individuals, but also populations and communities. And so I'll talk a bit about that. Starting with Exxon Valdez and some of the summaries by Pete Peterson and others from that, this notion that the spill itself could change the underlying productivity of the habitats, both on a temporary and in some cases a permanent basis, is an important one, because that changes the underlying productivity of the populations that depend on those habitats. And that means that this notion of a smooth transition back to the baseline probably is not going to happen. And so that's important as well. One of the things that was very important, not only in Deepwater, but also to a certain extent Exxon, was impacts of the oil spill countermeasures themselves. And so, for instance, the power washing the beaches and the spill in Alaska, certainly was a countermeasure used, and in retrospect was overused in that occasion. And I'm going to talk a bit about countermeasures and their potential impacts from Deepwater. That we are certainly involved now in a massive experiment to look at the effectiveness and the consequences of restoration activities that are being applied throughout the Gulf of Mexico, both in Deepwater and primarily up in relatively shallow areas, and massive investments in the Louisiana marshes. to try to turn back the consequences of sea level rise. And then one of the things that we found is that over time, a lot of things that we did not anticipate, the so-called black swans, occurred. And it's worth looking at those black swans from the ecosystem perspective as well. So actually, one of the main documents that one would look at in terms of an ecosystem approach to the impacts of deep water is the so-called PDARP, the Comprehensive Assessment of Ecosystem Level Impacts, the Programmatic Damage Assessment. This was a massive undertaking by both federal agencies and their contractors, and you can see the lineup here. And this, the reason this document is over 600 pages long is obvious, because the impacts are so widespread and diverse across a multitude of ecosystems, ranging from the deep benthic near the well site to the nearshore coastal areas and every sub-ecosystem in between. And so the PDARP is a great starting point. But of course, that looked at impacts up through the late 2015 and early 2016, and it's been an intervening 4 years since then. And so many other things have happened since then as well. So when we look at the ecosystem impacts of a massive spill like this, there are a number of what we would call cross-cutting issues that really we need to keep in mind as we look at the impacts that are assessed, and also try to make some projections. And they include, of course, the ecotoxicology, and that is both the acute and the chronic exposure routes, rates, concentrations, pathways. Remembering that the Gulf is an oily place to begin with, there is a certain level of chronic exposure. And so one of the issues that comes up is, will an acute large exposure, like from deep water, actually undermine the adaptive capacity of animals, organisms to fight chronic exposure and basically detoxify? And so that's been an issue that many people have looked at during Deepwater Horizon, to see if in fact we've undermined the adaptive capacity of these populations. Species interactions are very important in trying to understand the potential for trophic cascades. That is, by differentially impacting something that's in a trophic web, do we actually set off a cascade of other effects? And there's been a variety of modeling that's looked at that. Habitat modifications, that is either because of toxic source reservoirs in the deep water and shallow water, or the effects of some of the ongoing mitigation activities that have modified habitats. That's really important as well. Obviously, in a place like the Gulf of Mexico, cumulative effects of these multiple stressors, including not only ongoing activities of oil and gas, but heavy exploitation of natural resources, particularly through commercial and recreational fisheries, the effects of climate change and global warming, just a multitude of multiple stressors which are overlaying the effects of deep water. There are resource recovery trajectories, and that includes trying to understand from a population point of view whether the animal populations are what we would call R selected, that is relatively resilient populations that can recover quickly, or K selected, which are populations that rely on a large accumulated parental population and low productivity of juveniles. And so understanding that continuum of R and K strategies is important. The impacts of mitigation, that is all those oil spill countermeasures, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And last, and I think actually one of the really interesting takeaways from Deepwater is the notion of the connectivity of the system. And because this was a four-dimensional spill, you had both the notion of horizontal connectivity, that is resource populations, being adjacent, and then having some level of connectivity either through the adult movement or the egg and larval dispersal, where you can actually reseed a population. And then this notion of vertical connectivity, that things that occur in the deep don't necessarily stay in the deep. And so this connectivity issue is really important, I think, in terms of differentiating Deepwater Horizon from other oil spills that have occurred in the past. So just in terms of kind of a flow diagram of what I would like to talk about, we can start from sort of left to right here and talk about the pre-spill conditions occurring in the Gulf, where we can look at the vulnerability of organisms, populations, and ecosystems, and that's to the co-stressors that occur, irrespective of the oil spill. And again, there's a long list of them. The oil spill scenario occurs, and then you've got this notion of the resilience of these populations with the added effect of the spill volume, the distribution, the duration, and whether or not this is an acute event or it transitions to a chronic event. And then that can result in a number of effects, including these so-called Ali effects. That is, is it harder to find a mate, when populations are reduced to low levels? The notion of the modularity, that is, are these populations inherently unique modules, or is there a great deal of connectivity? The portfolio effect is where you have multiple populations that basically contribute to a larger population. Good example is Pacific salmon, where you've got a number of riverine populations that represent the portfolio that contribute to a larger entity. And then the post-spill outcomes are really where we're at in terms of recovery. We think often of in terms of natural recovery, and then of course restoration effects are those that attempt to speed the recovery or potentially increase the level of recovery, and they impact on the trajectories of recovery, the shape of the recovery trajectory, and then of course the notion of recovery to where and when. And these are quite pertinent to the current portfolio of restoration activities in the Northern Gulf of Mexico, because so much is being done to try to improve habitats and populations. And so this notion of stable recoveries is really going to press the limits, I think, and whether or not because of some of these recovery activities, we push the system into alternative and potentially stable states. Talk about that in a minute too. So there's a huge challenge in trying to get our arms around the modeling of Deepwater Horizon. I put this diagram up. This is from a paper that's out for review right now, titled "Towards Integrated Modeling of Long-Term Impacts of Oil Spills." These are all the, starting from the oil release scenario and at the top, you can see these are, there's a series of different domains of modeling and interaction that occur, in terms of, where the oil release results in transport and degradation, how that impacts the biological system, how that relates to human constructs like seafood, and how that works its way through that system, how that impacts in turn on human health and socioeconomics, and then of course the regulatory frame out here. Trying to do a model of everything is really difficult because of so many different aspects of this spill. And of course, if you wanted to do a model of everything, you'd have to quantify the functional relationships between all of these things, and then understand them in terms of the stochastic nature of many of these things as well. And so the notion that we could ever put a single model together that would actually capture all of this is well beyond the capabilities that we have, primarily to actually quantify those functional relationships as much as anything. But that's not to say that a lot of modeling hasn't been done. And so if you take that diagram we just saw, you can parse that into several domains. And so a lot of modeling from Deepwater has been done on the physical and biogeochemical environment. That is, particularly look at transport modeling. And that is, where do things go? When do they get there? And what concentrations are there? And then in terms of the biological domain, and that is, given that there is toxic effects in the environment, how are they taken up? What are their impacts on species, biomass, diversity, et cetera? How about assess stocks? And then, the notion of, all right, what are the impacts of some of the control mechanisms like fisheries closures? So the top two domains are fairly well developed. The areas where there's very, very little modeling at this point are the areas where you see these dashed lines. And so, for example, in the notion of mental health frameworks and even of human health frameworks, very little modeling that's gone on. And certainly over on the left-hand side, this notion of how the regulatory framework interacts with all this, this is really kind of, an area that has been qualitatively explained, but certainly not quantitatively modeled. I will point out in the biological realm and ecosystems, there have been a number of Atlantis models, both for the northern Gulf of Mexico and the southern Gulf of Mexico, where the Ixtoc spill occurred 35 years ago. Some ecopath models, and then a number of statistical models that have been worked on. So there is a fairly large body of modeling work that's been done. So I wanted to talk a little bit about going from this diagram to something that we perhaps can get our arms around a little bit better, and that is parsing the totality of the ecosystem response into 4 what we would call interconnected ecotypes. Now, that's not the proper use of the word ecotype, but nevertheless, the notion is that these are sub-ecosystems that we can try to explain, some of the dynamics of what is going on, recognizing that all of these ecotypes are actually interconnected. And so for the sake of argument, my colleagues and I have parsed up the impacts in the northern Gulf of Mexico into 4 of these so-called ecotypes: coastal inshore, the continental shelf, the open ocean, that is primarily the water column, and then the deep benthic impacts. And so I wanted to talk a little bit more in detail about some of the work that's gone on. And this includes not only work sponsored by the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative, but also NOAA, the states, variety of other funding organizations like NSF and others. So one of the important aspects, of course, of looking at this whole system is also looking at the system of countermeasures. And in terms of Deepwater Horizon, the major countermeasures are across the top and then over at the bottom right. So I'll talk primarily about river diversions and what they were intended to do and potentially what their impacts were. The creation of sand berms, and those of us who were around a decade ago can remember the issue of trying to create sand berms or improve some of the offshore islands in terms of trying to keep oil from coming ashore. Lots of skimming, burning, and aerial use of dispersant. And the unique countermeasure was the use of dispersant at the wellhead and so-called SSDI, or subsurface dispersant injection at the wellhead. Now, all of these impinge on different aspects of these 4 ecotypes. So, for example, many of the things across the top are impacting on the coastal nearshore area. Of course, it wasn't a coastal nearshore spill. The only way it got in there was transport at the surface. The spill was at the edge between the continental shelf and the deep benthic, and so you've got deep oil plumes that arose that were impacting the water column and certainly the deep benthic regions, and as well those plumes impacted the open ocean pelagic animals and then the animals on the continental shelf. So lots of really interesting interactions between not only the oil spill but the countermeasures that were used. And so trying to understand these interrelationships between these 4 ecotypes is kind of fundamental to putting the picture together from an ecosystem perspective. And I've already explained this a little bit. So in terms of the types of information that have been produced, there's really kind of 4 domains of information gathering that people have used to try to understand these effects. Starting from the upper left, the in situ survey and the monitoring. We're kind of fortunate in terms of looking at many of the resource populations that there was a very vigorous monitoring program that was in place prior to the Deepwater Horizon, primarily for natural resource management, and that is fisheries management primarily. All of the bordering states had their own monitoring programs, and the federal government primarily nymphs, also had fairly substantial monitoring. So that part is actually in pretty good shape. They weren't necessarily looking at things related to animal health, but nevertheless, animal abundance is pretty well done. A lot of the work that's gone on, since Deepwater, and certainly part of the NERDA, has been laboratory-based experiments and analyses. These are looking at dispersion and oil effects on growth and survival and reproduction and sublethal biomarkers, but they help to interpret the patterns that are going on in the field. The notion of comparative spatial analyses is really important in this case, and one of the things that was done was to actually go back to the areas off Mexico that were impacted by the Ixtoc 1 spill back in 1979-80 to see if we could actually learn something about the recovery rates of things like benthic animals by doing sediment cores from the regions impacted by that spill, because it was a comparable volume, even though it was a little bit shallower than Deepwater Horizon. And then, of course, field-based experiments. All of these basically can be put together in terms of the development of numerical predictive models. And so the whole notion of this isn't necessarily to try to repredict what Deepwater Horizon did, but try to be more predictive about the next deepwater oil spill. That is, what can we learn about the relationships between the animal populations and all these other things from these 4 domains of science that would help us to be more predictive about how the next spill might actually go. So just to briefly talk a little bit about some of the impacts in the different four different ecotypes. There's been a lot of work on sedimentary oil deposition associated with Deepwater Horizon. It was really interesting. I recall my conversations with the folks at the Office of Response and Restoration during the spill, and I talked to them a little bit about, well, should we start monitoring for oil on the sea bottom? And of course, the question everybody has is, well, obviously oil floats, so why are we worrying about it on the sea bottom? As it turns out, there's some really interesting mechanisms that brought a substantial quantity of Deepwater Horizon oil to the bottom, and they, in sort of layman's terms, they represent the dirty bathtub ring, where you've got the impingement of these deep plumes on the bathymetry. This is a very steep bathymetry, so as the deep water plumes manifested, they basically grounded on the bathymetry, and so you've got this bathtub ring of oil, and also you've got this the so-called dirty blizzard, and that is marine snow collecting oil on the way down and being deposited on seabed, and so that is probably the most important of those mechanisms, and that it was very broad in terms of the depositional layer. We can and also had some very serious impacts on the benthos, particularly in the region around the Deepwater Horizon. So here's some monitoring data that there was some historical monitoring data and lots of monitoring data after 2010. You can see that post Deepwater Horizon, it took quite a while to actually increase the total abundance of things. The diversity of much of the Meiofauna and Macrofauna actually went down, and this so-called nematode to copepod ratio went up. This is an indicator of pollution. It's interesting because in comparing both the southern Gulf of Mexico and the northern Gulf of Mexico, the benthic forams rebounded in like 5 to 7 years. It's a little bit slower in the southern Gulf of Mexico. But the interesting part of this is that given the sediment deposition rates, it may take 50 to 100 years to actually burrow the Deepwater Horizon layer below the layer of bioturbation of most of the benthic invertebrates. And so it's going to be quite a while until that actually happens. So Deepwater Horizon oil will be with us in the ecosystem for quite a while. In terms of the sediment deposition, over on the left, you can see the surface expression of the oil from Deepwater Horizon. In the center, you actually see this is based on sediment coring. You can see the hydrocarbons the relative percent change in hydrocarbons based on the comparison of the top layer to the deeper layers that weren't obviously not impacted by Deepwater Horizon. So you see these so-called depot zones or deposition zones, the red areas, and these tend to be areas where there's actually sediment flowing down the bathymetry. And so what we're seeing over time is actually the Deepwater Horizon sedimented oil is not staying in place, but it's actually sliding downhill. And you can actually see this in the so-called dead carbon as well, based on the sediment cores. So just moving on to the open ocean, one of the really startling things that was revealed by the work, and this includes not only the NOAA work where a lot of this started, but the work that my colleague Tracy Sutton and his group has been doing, is there's been a major decrease in all taxa in the mesopelagic fauna. So what you're looking at is the so-called ONSAP is the work that was done under NOAA, and these were basically looking at mock nest trawls in the mesopelagic. And so what you see here is these are the depth ranges, and there are two time comparisons, one 2010 to 11, that is right after Deepwater Horizon, and then a later time period, 2015 to 2018. And you can see in all cases, there's in all depth ranges a massive reduction between the 2010 to 11 to the current state, with no real recovery. And so this was like totally unanticipated. The interesting part of this is that there was in fact an increase in the PAHs that many of the mesopelagic fishes and invertebrates encountered. And so the real question here is this an impact of Deepwater Horizon? And if so, how long will it actually persist? Now, of course, these animals are, very abundant just because of this large size of this ecosystem, and they don't necessarily stay put, and they are important prey resources for a whole variety of animal populations as well. And so this is a really important effect. One of the sets of impacted populations are the marine mammals. And so, for example, there's been quite a bit of offshore passive acoustic monitoring of whales and dolphins. These are three areas that have had these HARP recorders on consistently since 2010. Green Canyon, Mississippi Canyon near Deepwater Horizon, and the Dry Tortugas is an out area. And you can see, particularly in the Mississippi Canyon, you've had fairly substantial decreases in the stenelids and then in things like sperm whales. And so we saw a major sort of reduction in sperm whale abundance here, and possibly to relocation to the Dry Tortugas area. But when you think about it, the sperm whales are primarily consuming squids, and if squid populations have been reduced dramatically in the mesopelagic area, particularly in the area around Deepwater Horizon, then that's probably a predator-prey effect that's ongoing. It's really important to try to understand this from the point of view of the vertical connectivity of these resources as well. And so this is a echogram that we collected in 2018 of the area just south of Deepwater Horizon. And so this is a nighttime daylight scan, and you can see these massive diel vertical migrations of some of the fishes and zooplankton from a number of layers, 500 meters, 750 meters and deeper. And then you see right at dusk, the vertical migration of these layers to the surface and then back down. This is important because of the animals that are interacting here. Obviously, these animals try to feed at nighttime, with the high level of phytoplankton that's in the surface layers. Many of these are planktonous animals, and so what happens is you can see a number of diel vertical migrations from these various layers. The reason this is important to people is that the large pelagic biomass in this region also takes advantage of this. So, for example, here you've got yellowfin tuna and lancet fish and wahoo that are surface feeders, in the epipelagic during the daytime. And then during the daytime, you've got these mesopelagic predators like swordfish and escalar that are down deep. At nighttime, the escalars, swordfish, et cetera, come to the surface, and this is why fishing for swordfish is basically a nighttime activity. But then, interestingly, you have an animal like the long-nosed lancetfish that actually does a reverse gill migration, and so it's down deep during the nighttime and up in the surface during the day. And the reason we know that, let me see here. The reason we know that, and of course this interacts with the oil plumes as well. If we start looking into food habits, we see some really interesting things. So this is a long-nosed lancetfish. These are hatchet fishes, which in this particular species occurs mostly at 700 to 1,000 meters. So this is showing up in the stomach, so you can see that these animals are partially digested, meaning this animal is caught during the daytime. This was probably its nighttime meal down and deep. But these are surface-dwelling animals. These are coral reef fishes, juveniles that have been exported offshore. So during the day, it's feeding here, and during the night, it's feeding there. And so the important thing here is that if, in fact, the SSDI was effective in making these deep water plumes, it's not like you're keeping the plumes buried. Because of the vertical migration of these animals, they're actually bringing potential pollution up to the surface, not only as prey, but to the predators themselves. And so, burying the oil in the deep doesn't necessarily mean it's going to stay there. And so there's a bunch of modeling activity that's ongoing to look at this sort of interaction, which I think is very important. So in terms of the continental shelf activities, there's clear evidence of exposure in a lot of the reef fishes that occur there. This is a paper on the left-hand side by Justin Lewis and his colleagues. They were highly effective reef areas near Deepwater Horizon and weaker effects to the west. You can see some of the changes in the species composition over time for many of the species that are involved here. And so, for example, things like red snapper and sea basses and other things, some of those things like scamp. And then one of the major things that you see, of course, over time has been an increase in lionfish populations. And this represents a really important challenge, and that is we're trying to interpret Deepwater Horizon effects, but also at the time when there's a coincident massive increase in invasive species. So here you see a video with an artificial reef just absolutely covered in lionfishes, right? And so the lionfishes are primarily eating small fishes like cardinal fishes, wrasses, damselfishes, et cetera. And so there's been a number of modeling activities that have been ongoing trying to understand these effects. But clearly this is an important confounding impact. Other data sets that relate to the continental shelves include the demersal longline sampling that has been ongoing. There was a series of sampling cruises that include the entire Gulf, and this allows some comparative spatial analyses of things like size spectra and diversity spectra, which allow us to interpret things like the relative resilience of some of these regions. So, for example, the size spectra has a very shallow slope in the northern Gulf of Mexico, which indicates that there's more, larger things are more abundant than the other two areas of Cuba and off Mexico. And so this necessarily means that the exploitation rates of some of these larger things are lower, which means that they're probably more resilient to things like an acute oil spill. And same thing with diversity spectra. You can see that in the northern Gulf of Mexico, particularly in larger sizes, you have more diverse populations in terms of the species composition as well. There's also, along with the abundance information and the things like size and diversity spectra, we've also been looking at trying to actually establish a baseline of environmental contamination. And so this paper that came out in Scientific Reports earlier this year looks at PAH pollution in samples collected throughout the Gulf of Mexico. And you can see the Deepwater Horizon hotspot here. You also can see a range of species contaminant levels from extremely high yellowfin tuna and golden tilefish to extremely low. These are some deep water animals that were more or less outside the range of Deepwater Horizon. So you can see that it's not a monolithic contaminant field, but very different depending on the life histories of the animals. And this also means that there are differential health impacts as well. One of the early issues that came up was the appearance of these skin lesions on things like red snapper, which became a very big issue, and whether or not they were a consequence of deep water or just people were just looking for them. There's a very strong correlation between the prevalence of these skin lesions and the average naphthalene concentrations in the bile. You can see that there's a negative relationship there. A positive correlation. And then there have been a number of laboratory studies that have actually validated that you can actually create the skin lesions with oil, particularly in the presence of a high bacterial load. So, it's hard to prove, something like this, but it seems like this was a consequence of deep water. Skip that one. Our last set of things I want to talk about was the notion of some of the inshore habitat issues, particularly as it relates to sediment diversions in the Mississippi River initially as a countermeasure, but as that relates to the long-term restoration potential as well. And so what you see here are the so-called SCAT technique results. These are shoreline oiling levels from basically no oiling to very high oiling. You can see in the Mississippi marshes, and particularly in Barataria Bay, very high levels of oiling. I want to point out two of the river diversions, one called Davis Pond, which is the blue, and the other one is Carnarvon, which is in the red, just to show you what they look like. These are the two diversions. You can see the pictures of them. This is the main stem Mississippi River out here, and this is the diversion. Davis Pond basically diverts water into the upper Barataria Bay, and Carnarvon basically into Black Bay and eventually into Breton Sound. You can see that in 2010, the levels of water diverted in terms of the mean discharge were very high relative to seasonal averages. In the case of Davis Pond, it was more than 4 times the seasonal average, and in the case of Carnarvon, more like 8 times the seasonal average. And so there's a lot of fresh water that came down into those bays that had consequence for a number of species populations. This is a SAR image, a synthetic aperture radar image showing the oil itself transiting through the passes at Grand Isle and into Barataria Bay. Remember that those water diversions were meant to try to keep the oil from coming ashore. You can see it did a really good job of doing that. Clearly it had very little impact on the transition of oil into those bays. And frankly, you can find that oil even today in very heavily oiled shoreline up just north of the bay's passes at Grand Isle. This is a really great study by Gene Turner, Nancy Rabelais, and Ed Overton, looking at the concentration of PAHs in the marsh sediment. And there's 3 time periods here that they looked at. May 2010, just before the oil entered the Barataria Bay. And so you can see that the sum of the PAH is about 0.98. Later on in February of 2011, you can see that it increased by a factor of 600. These are the densities of the individual, the concentration of the individual PAHs in the homologs. And by 2018, it had actually been reduced by 2 orders of magnitude, but still is an order of magnitude higher than the baseline. The interesting thing about this is that once this oil gets below the aerobic layer, it's basically going to be there for a very long time. And so, and this is based on a lot of different studies that have gone on in places like the West Falmouth oil spill and others. So it's very likely that that Deepwater Horizon oil will be there in those marshes for basically the extended period of time of decades. So as I said before, there's lots of data that the individual states have collected, and I wanted to briefly go through some of those data, particularly concentrating on Louisiana, with the three areas of these watersheds: the Terrebonne, Barataria, and Pontchartrain. State of Mississippi, state of Alabama, and state of Florida. They all have trawl surveys, they all have oyster surveys and other things, so they can give us an interesting lens on what actually is happening. One of the important aspects of what went on because of the freshwater discharges is the tremendous loss of oysters that occurred. And the bottom line here is that you can see these areas of dark in the lower left-hand corner where there was lots of freshwater influence, particularly with the discharges. And the bottom line is that the oyster losses numbered in the billions over normal periods of time, and this is because of the persistent, very low levels of salinity that occurred in the upper Barataria Bay and also the Breton Sound Black Bay area for a very long period of time. And that's the Powers et al. Paper in 2017 documented this. If we look at the time series data, you can see that post Deepwater Horizon, it's been kind of a mixed bag. The Alabama oyster situation has continued to decline over a very long period of time. In Barataria Bay, there was a big reduction in oyster populations, but they seem to come up for a few years, but they're back down to relatively low levels. In Terrebonne, much the similar situation. You can see a big drop, primarily because there wasn't the large discharges of low salinity fresh water into Terrebonne, but over time we've seen a reduction in oyster populations there. There are a number of other resource populations that we can gather data on from all these trawl surveys. Bottom line is that it's been kind of a mixed bag. The interesting thing on the right-hand panels is that the red drum, which tend to be more of a freshwater species, have done very much better than the spotted sea trout, which tend to prefer more saline habitats. And so you can see that there was an initial increase, particularly in Barataria Bay, which may in fact be an effect of the fishery closures, but that's come down a little bit. Whereas if you look at the red drum, they seem to do very, very well, at least up through the first 5 years after the Deepwater. And then you can also look at all species combined. And the interesting thing about this, and I won't dwell on it, is that if you look at all species that are taken in these trawl surveys, they've generally declined, and the fin fishes have followed that, and the invertebrates have been going down a little bit more steeply. The freshwater species have increased. And that's a consequence of the long-term patterns of freshwater discharge into some of these areas. In terms of Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida, really no impacts of the Deepwater Horizon that are obvious. A species like Gulf menhaden is an interesting one because you can see that Gulf menhaden really did not suffer in terms of either their landings, the catch per unit of effort, or the fecundity of the population over time. Just in terms of what has gone on, but primarily this is an impact of fisheries management. That in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the fishery was catching about 1 million metric tons a year, and so that was overfishing that stock, and so they dropped the catch to around 500,000 metric tons, which reduced the fishing mortality rate and has resulted in much higher levels of population fecundity, and so this population was able to withstand the Deepwater. And one of the issues that I think has made that particular population more resilient is the fact that the timing was everything. That the oil didn't arrive into the historic spawning grounds until early June, and in most cases, since they spawned in peak from December to February, they were already back up in the estuary before the oil transitioned here. So a lot of this is actually quite dependent on the particulars of the timing of the potential exposure of various life stages. One of the things I wanted to point out was that if we look at the long time series of data for places like Barataria Bay, there's been a substantial regime shift in the abundance and composition of fishes and invertebrate communities since Deepwater. So this is a so-called SimProf analysis, or similarity profile analysis. And so the various years of trawl data are arrayed across the top, and the various species are arrayed down the side. And you can see that in the upper right corner, this represents the years from virtually in sequence from 2013 to 2018. And you can see that there's been a reduction in abundance. The scale is the fourth root of the catch per trawl. Virtually this entire set of species from southern flounder down to stardrum, which tend to be more of the more saline dependent animals, in favor of some of the more freshwater dependent animals. And you know, the importance of this is that this phase shift in terms of these groups occurred right at 2010. So you can see that all of the years from Deepwater Horizon until 2018 are in the right-hand side of this diagram. And if you do a so-called non-metric multi-dimensional scaling of this, you can see that the years 2010, 11, and 12 are kind of transition. You've got the historical data set, and then you've got this new data set, and they're very discrete in terms of what's going on. And so it looks to us like there's been a very substantial step change in the composition of this community over time. And one could actually look at this in terms of some of the environmental drivers here. Just as a note, Davis Pond began operations in 2002, and you can see that historically there were a number of years where you had relatively high salinity, but since 2002 and certainly since 2010, the level of the salinity level at these trawl stations has gone down dramatically. And the water clarity has actually gone up. And so this is probably impacting these populations. And if you do a redundancy analysis, you can clearly see this. You see the time sequence in blue of the various years, and then you see the environmental drivers. And so you see things like bay whiff and rock shrimp and pinfish. These are animals that tolerate higher levels of salinity in favor of things that have basically a lower salinity regime, channel catfish, blue catfish, black drum, etc. Why is this important? Well, if we consider a scenario where we're likely to have a lower salinity because of long-term water diversions for basically sediment capture and higher temperatures because of global warming, then that may in fact favor this quadrant of species in the lower left-hand corner as opposed to the other ones. In addition to the finfish work, there's been quite a bit of work by a number of folks looking at health effects and things like the dolphins in the northern Gulf of Mexico. Just point out this internal panel here. This is the prevalence of low cortisol in the animals, and using Sarasota Bay as an outgroup, you can see that these animals have an impaired stress response, increased mortality, low reproductive stress, et cetera, et cetera. The projections there are decades to recover. So the last little bit I want to talk about, and I'll stop talking, is how does this relate to the long-term recovery and restoration efforts that are ongoing? So I talked a little bit about the two sediment diversions that currently are operational, the Davis Pond and the Carnarvon. There are a number, 7 additional sediment diversions that are planned for the Mississippi River that will impact both in the Barataria and the Breton Sound region, and they're aligned here. And if you actually look at these sediment diversions, they combined at their maximum capacity would be diverting something like 194,000 cubic feet per second, which is more than 10 times the maximum diversion rate seen during Deepwater. Now, that's not to say that all of these things will be operating at maximum capacity, but nevertheless, if we've already seen a freshwater impact in terms of the structure of the ecosystems, we can anticipate that it would be at least the level that we've seen and maybe even higher. And so we can anticipate some of these freshwater impacts impacting the community structure and the abundance of many of the animals in this region. And then these are predictions of what the salinity will do in various parts of the bay. And so you can see, for example, with and without diversions in this lower Barataria Bay area, you can see that the salinities will go down fairly substantially up until 2035. And this is when sea level rise kicks in, in terms of flooding over some of the barrier islands. So one of the last things I wanted to talk about was this. One of the things that we were able to do is to actually come up with a new set of analyses that are what we call the vulnerability resilience analysis. And that is, are there ways that we can actually classify all the different species into to classifying animals that might be more vulnerable to the particulars of Deepwater Horizon and what their level of resilience might be. And so much like PSA analysis, which is known in fisheries, there are a series of attributes that one can assign, and these are based on, in the case of vulnerability, where are the animals relative to the timing and concentrations of things like the oil itself and the countermeasures, and then what factors in the populations impact resilience, like their lifespan, age of first reproduction, fecundity, et cetera. And so one of the things that we did was, for all these ecotypes, array out the species in this vulnerability and resilience matrix. So for example, in the coastal nearshore, the animals with relatively low vulnerability and high resilience are things like menhaden, and those are contrasted with things like the Barataria Bay dolphins, which have high vulnerability and low resilience. And one of the take-home messages from all of this is that we thought that we might be able to use this kind of analysis to show that some ecotypes are more vulnerable and less resilient than others. But it seems like there's a fair smattering of both vulnerable and resilient populations throughout these ecosystems. And so classifying them by habitats is probably not a clean way to do this, in that you really have to know the details of the species as well as the habitats themselves. So just in terms of some conclusions, the four major ecotypes exhibited a wide array of impacts to species and communities, ranging from trivial to catastrophic. Even 10 years subsequent to Deepwater, many resources haven't recovered, and some may never recover because we've reached tipping points. Nearshore resources were impacted particularly by some of these spill countermeasures, which actually give us some insights into some of the potential effects of restoration activities. We're blessed with some long time series data, both for the coastal inshore and the continental shelves, which allow us to contextualize some of the other drivers. The long-term surveys do document large pools of partially weathered oil in the environment, both in marshes and deep areas, and those sources will be with us for decades. If the Ixtoc is an example, certainly the deep ocean biota is poorly understood, and that's problematic because that's where the majority of this oil industry is going in the long term. Nearly 60% of the oil is now produced in ultra deep wells, and so if we need to chase the industry, we need to know more about the deep water biota. These long-term remediation programs like marsh reconstruction may have consequential long-term impacts on some of the ecologically and environmentally important species, and we need to assess these, I think, a little bit better. One of the important takeaway messages is that many of these effects may be quite idiosyncratic to the species, and so trying to sort of paint a broad brush in terms of what's happening to the environment may leave out a lot of important details. And lastly, the next large spill will certainly produce a number of other black swans or unanticipated impacts in terms of these environmental issues. I won't dwell on the priorities. You can read the paper. With that, I'd like to acknowledge a whole bunch of sources, and particularly Peg and Lisa for their impacts and support. And with that, I'll turn it back.
Thank
Steve,
you.
thank you very much.
Appreciate it. We're at the hour, but I'd like to give people an opportunity to ask any questions live. So if you have a question, please go ahead and enter it in the question box on the right. And even if we don't address it today, I'll forward them to Steve so that he can address them offline. Just as a reminder, Steve has graciously given us his slides as a handout. So if you look to the right under handouts, you can download the PDF of his presentation today. And also, while I wait to see if we get any questions, I wanted to remind you that this webinar was recorded, and we encourage you to share the link with interested colleagues or watch the beginning of the presentation if you joined us late. You can find the recording on the NOAA Central Library YouTube channel, the Library Seminars webpage. I don't see any questions yet. Let's see.
Yeah, and Lisa, you can also see the past seminars there as well at that link. So just a reminder, and please share that with your colleagues as well that could not join us today.
Absolutely, yeah, it's a lot to look at the YouTube channel for NOAA Central Library. We just got a question.
Okay. And Steve has his address there for folks who want to follow up with Steve directly and his team.
This question asks, how would saltwater marsh remediation help with recovery of water quality, oysters, and crabs?
Oysters in particular are highly sensitive to fresh waters, and so it's really going to be a very important aspect of these diversions to manage the saltwater gradient, because oysters can't tolerate salinities below about 5 parts for more than a few weeks, right? And so managing that salinity gradient is going to be important for long-term oyster health in the region. And so that's certainly going to be something that the restoration managers are going to have to manipulate in order to keep that part viable. In terms of crabs, they have a very complex life history where they're basically larvae are out in the ocean and then they recruit back into the estuary, but they can recruit back to very fresh waters for extended periods of time. And so that's a little bit more difficult to actually ascertain. It's likely that there'll be a shifting down estuary, particularly with higher levels of freshwater input, but it's not so clear and dry, in terms of the scenario with oysters.
Excellent. Well, that concludes the hour. And again, if your question was not addressed today, I am forwarding them to Steve after this presentation. I'd like to conclude. Oh, go ahead.
I just have one more announcement. Just our next seminar in this series is on December 9th, the second Wednesday next month. And it's Ellen Spooner from our Office of Science and Technology providing an overview of our new NOAA Fisheries National Marine Ecosystem Status website, just released just 2 weeks ago. And so Ellen will walk us through that and show that new website. So we're looking forward to sharing that with you on the next month. And stay tuned for next year, as we have a number of speakers lined up for next year. And we hope you all, thank you for joining us today, and hope you can join us in the future and share this information with your colleagues. And again, Steve, thanks to you and your team down there. I appreciate all your efforts on this.
Thank you, Peg, and thank you, Lisa.
Thank you both. And we appreciate everyone joining us today. I hope everyone is well. Take care.